Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's finally time to get into the next discography review. I'm talking about the 1993 debut album from µ-Ziq, Tango, and Vectif. I've covered many different kinds of electronic artists over the years, but the bread and butter of this channel is pretty much always going to be early 90s IDM. It's a wellspring that I've kept returning to lots of times and gotten plenty of my most successful discography reviews out of it, like Aphex Twin, Outtaker, Boards of Canada, or Square Pusher. Not all of those are early 90s, but you get what I mean. And by popular demand, it's time for me to return to that wellspring once again. But pretty much everyone who's familiar with the term IDM already knows those four artists I've listed. There are some artists right there alongside them on that scene that have similar notoriety for those aware of their existence, but seem to not get talked about nearly as often. And so, that takes us to the one and only Mike Paradinas, aka µ-Ziq. Or µ-Ziq if you want to say it that way. I've gone back and forth with it, but µ-Ziq is the official pronunciation. At this point, I've reviewed this guy's work plenty of times already. As of recording this video, I've already done 5 different videos on him, including his most recent main album, Magic Pony Ride, from just a few months ago. And he's probably fairly fresh in people's minds, especially with having just released another little companion album to that one called Hello last week, which I will not be reviewing, since despite also being quite good in its own right, it's basically more of the same kind of stuff as Magic Pony Ride, and doesn't feel like its own thing as much. So chances are, a lot of people watching this at the time of its upload won't actually need an introduction to him, but given this is the beginning of a playlist, I'll give one anyway. Paradinas is an IDM legend who's been at it for decades. Probably best known these days for being the founder of the well-known Planet Mu label, which has been home to so many different forward-thinking artists over the years, from Venetian Snares, to R.P. Boo, to Jlin, to Luke Vibert, to Jega, to Itel Tech, to Basic Rhythm, and so many others. But even back when he started, he was one of the most notable artists on the scene. He was good friends with Aphex Twin back in the day. The two were often directly inspired by each other. I suspect his influence may have been one of the bigger deciding factors for RDJ to go in the direction he did for his I Care Because You Do and Richard D. James albums. They even did a collab album together at one point, which I've also already reviewed. And Paradinas' debut album here from 1993 was first released on RDJ's Reflex label, and the album cover of the original CD version was a photo taken by James. Well, okay, I should also clarify, at this point, µ-Ziq was not technically a solo project of Mike Paradinas alone, but a duo? The other member being Paradinas' college friend Francis Naughton, who'd played bass in a short-lived band with Paradinas called Blue Innocence that never officially released anything that I know of. Granted, Naughton's contributions to this album ended co-writing credits on 5 tracks, being Music, Theme, Vibes, Cesium, 4-Time Egg, and Whale Soup. Everything else on the album is just Paradinas solo anyway, and Naughton left the group to focus on college work shortly after this album dropped, leaving µ-Ziq to officially become a solo alias for Paradinas, so yeah. Technically a duo, but only barely and not enough for me to openly refer to it as such for the rest of this video. Now, getting into the album itself. I've hinted at my thoughts on this a few times in the past. I included this album in my list of my top 100 favorite electronic albums of all time back in 2016, so it probably should not surprise you to hear that I still love this album to this day. I consider it an absolute classic and one of the all-time IDM greats. Right from the first time I heard this album, I was immediately struck by the combination of how hard all the distorted beat work went, with all the fantastic melodies layered on top of each track, and especially the melodies, melodically setting itself apart from any of the other IDM artists of the time with some mild jazz and funk and pop influences, I guess. Tango and Vectif is a fairly abrasive album, but I also think it's pretty easily accessible as well. Many of these tracks have really bright and catchy tunes, and when they don't, they at least have really hard-hitting and easily danceable grooves. And Paradinas just keeps delivering banger after banger after banger without ever missing. I don't put this album on in its entirety super often, but whenever I do, I'm always kind of floored by how damn consistent it is, and how there's just no bad tracks in the bunch. As for why I don't put this album on in its entirety very often, that does pretty much just come down to one very simple attribute to the album. The length! The most widely available version of this album, the 2001 re-release, is an expanded edition that contains 26 tracks and stretches well over 2 hours in total. That alone makes it a bit difficult to recommend. The album's original release wasn't quite as eye-poppingly overstuffed, but it was still pretty damn long. The CD version had 15 tracks stretching over 70 minutes, and the vinyl version had 17 tracks stretching just over 90 minutes. I personally consider the original vinyl version to be the definitive track listing and the true intended core of the album, but the 2001 re-release is the one I'm covering and the one I'm most used to. That version follows the vinyl version's track listing in its entirety, but then adds an additional 9 tracks at the end, which I sort of consider more like bonus tracks. Among which are the CD exclusive tracks, which didn't appear on the original vinyl, the original B-sides taken from the album's only single, Phi 1700 UV, and a couple of other cuts from the same era which had never been previously released. It's a lot, and I'll admit there isn't exactly a super wide stylistic variety here, like that which carried his next album, Bluff Limbo, to make up for it. A lot of these tracks follow pretty similar sonic formulas and even kind of run together a little bit in certain parts. But even so, whenever I put this album on in its full 2-hour glory, I don't come out at the end sick of this style or feel like the sound ever wore out on me. The melodies and grooves are just that consistently good. It is probably an album that might be better suited to, like, picking out your favorite tracks and cutting out ones that you don't care for as much, but I never ran into any tracks that I ever felt like outright skipping. Even the worst ones at least have something to like about them. I'm sure there will be disagreements on which of those tracks do fall flatter than others, but I hope at the very least we can all agree that this album's opening 5-track stretch is absolutely fantastic and among the best the entire IDM world has to offer to this day. The tone is set right away with all the crashing, distorted mechanical beats and warm melodic pads of the title track, which keep building in new melodic elements that are super catchy, and good freaking god, do the beats just slap harder and harder as the track just goes along. When that big banging snare comes in, it's just like, you can't help but headbang. The vast majority of the tracks on this album feel kind of like variations on this particular set of musical ingredients, but they're just always so damn addicting and easy to get into. Second track, Swan Vesta, is one of my favorite IDM tracks of all time, and probably my favorite cut out of all of them. The melodies on this one are even warmer and more welcoming and catchier than that of the opener. The skittering beat patterns are even more complex and layered, but slap just as hard. There's a bit more of a sense of progression over 6 minutes, but it still always feels like it's firmly sticking to the same groove and tune. It manages to be a ton of mindless crashing fun while also sounding surprisingly beautiful. But the album isn't afraid to have more delicate moments as well, as seen with the next 2 tracks, Burnt Sienna and Iesope, which have a slight bit more of an ambient leaning, or at least don't involve nearly as abrasive beat work. Burnt Sienna is one of the longest tracks in the bunch at just over 8 minutes, but doesn't feel like it, as all the mixes of cascading keyboard licks and light percussion taps just remain very alluring. There's strange evolutions into other marginally creepier and more metallic sounding spaces, and it all makes that time just seem to go by a lot faster. And Iesope, or Iesope? Iesope? That track has a much more mysterious, more nocturnal and spacey blend to its melodic blips and echoing percussion taps that also maintains the slight more playful edge that carries over the entire album. Most of it. And then of course there's µ-Ziq theme, which has all of these bright and bubbly arpeggios ascending and descending at a rapid pace and going over lots of marching breakbeats. Another one of the most memorable sounding cuts, and indicative enough of the usual Paradinas style to live up to the hype the title sets for it. Could act as like the opening theme to his own imaginary TV show, I don't know. These first 5 tracks are nothing short of amazing, but I will admit that the album doesn't keep up that particular high standard of quality through its entire running time, and you can run into some less striking cuts from this point onwards. For instance, the following track, Aukim, was never much of a favorite. All its clouds of ambient pads and plinky melodic licks feel way more formless and structureless with no real tune, and the distorted breakbeat underscoring the entire thing, as hard-hitting as it is, feels oddly disconnected from the sounds placed on top of it. Still a good track, but not nearly as strong as the ideas that came before. Might even mark it as my least favorite in the main core of the album. And it does mark the beginning of a stretch on the album where the melodies tend to get a lot harsher and more dissonant on average, aren't quite as easily accessible or tuneful. But that doesn't always translate to worse tracks. Vibes is pretty dang cool. The disorienting melodies of its synth vibraphone sound like they could work as like a soundtrack cue for a mystery movie, and the creeping breakbeats do add to that effect nicely enough while keeping the usual playful edge intact. Add Misericordiam has all these creepy morning pads and energetic beat patterns that build up and down in a fun way, and the final effect reminds me of what Aphex Twin would go on to do with a track like Ictedral. And Die Zweite Heimat is a particular grower too. Its cold and foreboding pads, plunky acid bass, and various layers of mechanical tapping come together in a surprisingly effective foot tapping groove. But you can also run into tracks like Beatnik No. 2, which feels rather oily and unpleasant, and its weird mix of metallic tones really further this menacing and uncomfortable vibe. Obviously very intentionally so, and certainly effective at what it's going for, but it does completely ditch the more playful tone of my favorite tracks on here in the process. Pretty much all the other tracks still have at least a little bit of that fun edge, where this one doesn't really. And I have no idea why the original 1993 CD version ended with this track. That is a terrible choice of closer. And there's also the Sonic Fox, which, while focusing on one of the harder-hitting sets of breakbeats, feels a bit too barren outside of that. There's a few acid bass licks and some warmer pads on top, but they're barely present, and the intense fuzzed-out distortion of some of the beats has a way of swallowing up those details. Again, neither of these are skips, and they're well sequenced on the album to not feel out of place. They're just not really moments I actively look forward to as much as some others here. But the album does pick back up the more accessible melodic edge after this, getting into a track like Cesium, which feels much happier, more carefree and lighthearted than all those darker moments that led up to it, with all its twinkling melodic arpeggios and quirky marching beatwork. Lots of fun, but that finally leads into the album's above-mentioned only single, Phi 1700 UV, which finally returns me in earnest to the same level of excitement that the first few tracks could so easily induce in me. Swan Vesta may be my favorite track on the album now, but this was my favorite track when I first heard the album, and it might still stand as my second favorite on the album. The buzzing beats, as usual, go really hard, but are more addicting and danceable than many of the other tracks that came immediately before it. But then it's joined by all these surprisingly heartwarming and cheerful pad progressions and these seemingly improvised synth vibraphone melodies. It has this really endearingly odd childlike quality to it that I had never gotten out of any IDM track I had heard in quite the same way before, and the texture of those vibraphone synths were really striking to me. It was the kind of track that really set apart Mike Paradinas' specific talents apart from all his contemporaries on the scene, and never fails to put me in a better mood whenever I put it on. Now, this is the end of the first disc of the album, and that would make for a serviceable ending in its own right, but of course we just keep going on after that. 4-Time Egg feels like an even better executed version of the idea behind Cesium, again very lighthearted and carefree with lots of high-pitched melodic loops, but later joined by these synth choir pads that add a whole different, more intriguing atmospheric quality to the mix that pulls me in even more. And then that finally takes us to the 3-part suite of Phragmal Synthesis, which I personally perceive to be the album's true intended ending. If this album were a movie, this suite is where the main character rides off into the sunset and the credits start rolling. Part 1 really has that sense of bittersweet finality to its melodies and just keeps evolving and adding new ideas, bringing in these twinkling chimes later on and building up the beats more. Part 2 takes some of the melodies left over at the end and explores them in a slightly sparser mix with thicker marching beats and sub-bass, introduces some squeakier percussion and some less final-sounding vibraphone chords, and eventually leads into Part 3, which switches up the beat to a more up-tempo pace, switches the bass line to a rounder, more acidish texture, and introduces other keyboard melodies. The entire suite does really feel like it could work as like a lengthy staff credit sequence in a video game. Each part does work off each other well, even if it doesn't exactly end up in the same territory it started in. I only wish the 3 parts connected to each other more seamlessly instead of Part 1 fading out and Part 2 containing a short silence before Part 3 started. Still, fantastic set of tracks, really feels like the perfect ending to an album like this. Of course, we still got 9 more tracks to go after this, but again, I treat those more like bonus tracks. Though, even if they are kind of more bonus tracks to me, they're nearly all just as good as the stuff from the main bulk of the album, too. Again, if this album were like a video game and Phragmal synthesis is the staff credits, the 9 tracks that follow it are like the post-game DLC missions or something. First, you got the 3 tracks which were originally exclusive to the CD version in 1993. Xenith Filigree Anus has a lot more of the foreboding metallic quality of some of the tracks in that middle stretch of the main album, but has a lot more interesting progressions than those cuts did. At first, focusing on these ghostly arpeggios and light disorienting chords that sound like metal squeaking, but also introducing these really epic bass washes and more intense beats to go alongside it. It may be more creepy than it is fun and lively, but man does it nail that mood well and have the substance to back itself up. I didn't care for this track when I first heard it since I found its melodies too off-putting, but now I like it more than most of those more metallic and dissonant cuts in the middle of the first disc. It's epic. Whale Soup has some really neat progressions of synth strings with other light and ghostly melodic plinks that are pretty easy to sink myself into. Definitely has more of a haunting quality than many other tracks in the main bulk of the album, but doesn't feel as well developed as other moments here. But Amenida 2 is lots of fun. Has all these really fast-paced, high-pitched synth arpeggios that eventually get joined by these really rich and emotional keyboard chords and sounds great. Really bright and striking and attention-grabbing stuff. But of course, those were originally album tracks. It makes sense for them to be just as high quality as the other album tracks on the vinyl version. What about the B-sides from the 1700 single? Well, Paco is a winner. Got all these marching band snares going up next to all these synth xylophones and wiry and funky synth cores that seem to directly point to what he eventually did on his track Make It Funky on Bluff Limbo. Even if Make It Funky is better, this still slaps. Crosstown Traffic is less of a winner for me, if only because of its opening moments, which feature all these wiry pads and melodic planks that are musically super harsh and dissonant. Possibly even the most sour and unpleasant tune that's been showcased here yet. But it does pick up more as the crashing, distorted breakbeats come in later and some more fun, acidy bass lines are introduced as well. It is definitely able to pick up more of a fun groove, and say what you will about it, it definitely lives up to its title and feels like a big chaotic traffic jam. And Xolbe 2 has this constant pad of noise that sounds like a vacuum cleaner running through the entire track, but is still able to somehow work that into a fairly effective ambient cut with some warm melodic licks and tapping beats. Not the kind of idea that I would have thought would work on paper, but it is actually surprisingly calming, and the vacuum cleaner noise is able to add to that effect. I think that one works quite well. And then there's the entirely unreleased tracks at the end. I really liked Driving is Easy, very simple and stripped back melodica that is kind of structured like Xolbe 2, without the vacuum cleaner noise. The lead melodic riff is surprisingly catchy, the mood is nice and laid back, and is even more effective than some of the tracks that actually made the original album. But on the other hand, you got Methyl Albion, which is the only track out of all 26 in this collection that I've ever actively wanted to skip. It's not terrible by any means, but it's not exactly good either. Trying to build some more heartfelt melodies around this really obnoxious wheezing pad and these other stabbing arpeggios that feel like they're just ever so slightly out of tune. Some of the other melodic textures in the really slow, distorted 80s power ballad beat are nice enough, but it just never really comes together and I don't know how it wants me to feel. Maybe this one would have been better off locked away in the archive vault. Thankfully, we finished with Glink. Technically, this track was released on specific versions of the 1700 single, although I'm told that may or may not just be a misprint. Whatever, this is the official version. And it's got lots of playful house pianos going up next to various waves of glittering melodies and beats that start out really sparse but eventually end up in some of the most intensely distorted territory of any track here and just completely drown out everything underneath it. I mean, okay, I guess the production on this track is kinda dog shit, with how blown out it can be. But I still like it a lot. I don't think the distortion ruins the intended effect. If this were given, like, a little bit of remastering to at least sound as good as the stuff on the main album, it'd be more than good enough to include in that context. And even in its current unpolished form, it still makes for a perfectly satisfying finish to this whole collection. But yeah, that's everything on Tango and Vectif. It's a lot. Arguably way too much for its own good, but I still enjoy pretty much all of it. Again, I don't think the sound ever gets old even over 2 hours. The fact that I think there's only one skip out of 26 is really saying something. And even that one skip is just not even that bad. And again, the best moments are some of my favorite IDM tracks ever made. Mike Paradinas would go on to be able to further his craft and polish it a lot more in years to come. Put out releases that aren't quite so overstuffed and are much better focused. And I stand by his next album, Bluff Limbo, being an improvement upon this album in every way, with much more of an ability to justify its length. But Tango and Vectif is right up there for me in the same bracket of quality. Not every track may knock it out of the park, but it still does such a good job of keeping my attention from start to finish. I would definitely understand anyone who thinks this album is way too goddamn long, even if they're talking about the original vinyl version. If you just prefer to keep around a handful of your favorite tracks instead of sitting through the whole thing, that would work just as well. But I feel like any IDM enthusiasts need to hear the entire thing from front to back, including bonus tracks, at least once in their life. Even if they don't like all of it. Doesn't have to be all in one sitting, but I do think this thing justifies way more of its length than it probably has any right to. And even if he got better at crafting full albums and giving them all, like, unique identities later on, these first two albums just have all my favorite tracks from him gathered together all in the same place, and they're always going to stand as my favorite work he's ever put out. The melodies here are super addicting and mood-brightening whenever they're there. If they're not, then the break beats are freaking nasty and grooving in the best possible way. Even in my least favorite moments, he's basically doing similar ideas to those on Aphex Twin's I Care Because You Do, but better and 2 years prior. Unwieldy as it may be, Tango and Vectif is always going to have a special place in my heart. I still think it stands as one of the all-time IDM classics. I'm overall feeling an 8.7 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.